Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our event this evening at Princeton Public Library. This is a great pleasure to have you here tonight for this event. I'm Janie Herman, the Public Programming Librarian at Princeton Public Library, and I will be hosting this evening for you tonight. Just before I bring our special guests on, just a few housekeeping notes. Right now, the chat is open, but I will have that closed during the main event. It will open up again at the end. We are really going to encourage you to ask questions of our guests tonight. And there is at the bottom of your screen a place where it says ask a question. So feel free to pop your questions in the ask a question box. Also, Labyrinth is our book partner for tonight, and they have Chris's book in stock within the social media Prism. And it is available for a 10% discount if you enter the promo code BAIL, B-A-I-L, at checkout, or there's instructions in the chat for in-store or curbside pickup if you're local, to email and just mention this event to receive the discount. And I also want to thank Princeton University Press, our partners on tonight's event. They are great supporters of the library in general, and they always bring us such fascinating authors. And we're so grateful that we have the press in our town to work with. So tonight's event brings to you Chris Bail, who is a professor of sociology and public policy at Duke University, where he directs the Polarization Lab. He studies political tribalism, extremism, and social psychology using data from social media and tools from the emerging field of computational social science. He has been a Guggenheim Fellow and Carnegie Fellow, and his research papers have appeared in leading academic I'm back. I'm sorry. Let me hit the wrong button. Everybody still here with me? Say yes in the chat. Yay. Okay, so I'm going to go back to that first part. He's a Guggenheim Fellow and a Carnegie Fellow. His research appears in leading academic journals, as well as in mainstream newspapers and magazines. His 2015 book, Terrified: How Anti-Muslim Fringe Organizations Became Mainstream, received 3 awards and resulted in an invitation to address the 2016 Democratic National Convention. Chris is passionate about building the field of computational social science. And so we are so pleased to welcome him today to talk about his latest book, Breaking the Social Media Prism: How to Make Our Platforms Less Polarizing. And he's going to be joined in conversation today by Meagan Levinson, who is the executive editor and head of paperback publishing at Princeton University Press, and who was the editor with him on this book. And so I think this conversation is going to be particularly fascinating because we will have both the editor and the author in conversation. There's Chris, and let me bring up Meagan okay. Wonderful. I have a new mouse, and what I did is I accidentally hit a button on the side of my mouse, and it popped me out of there. Who knew? Okay. So I'm going to disappear. I'll be here in the background if you need me. Remember, guys, ask your questions in the Ask a Question box, and you guys take the conversation away. Thanks so much.
Great. Chris, I am so delighted to be talking to you about your book tonight. This is a different role for me, but I'm really excited about it. I don't know if you remember, but we first started talking about this book at a reception at the American Sociological Association conference back in 2018. And you were excitedly telling me about this new paper about social media and polarization. It seems like everyone has an opinion about polarization online, or about polarization generally, I guess. But so much of it is just conjecture. And what drew me in was the fact that you had devised this very clever experiment, and you had real data about what happens when you take people outside of their echo chambers and expose them to opposing views. So tell us briefly about that initial experiment.
Sure. Thanks so much, Meagan. I think I've got some echo here. Janie, are you there? Is it bearable?
I can't hear it. Any echo.
Oh, okay. Sorry, everybody. Okay. Well, I was about to say thank you very much to Meagan and to Janie for setting this up into Labyrinth Books. This is a really great opportunity, and I'm really excited to dive in. So yeah, why did we wind up with this unique experiment? Well, it was 2017, and I think a lot of people were kind of trying to make sense of events like the election of Donald Trump or the Brexit referendum, which I think surprised a lot of people. And the echo chamber kind of provides a pretty neat explanation, right? I mean, the reason we didn't see it coming is because we were all not seeing each other. And so, you know, Democrats who only saw people, say, disparaging Trump didn't see the palpable enthusiasm that people on the Republican side saw, for example. And so when we first put together the Polarization Lab, which is an interdisciplinary group of data scientists, social scientists like me, and computer scientists and political scientists, this seemed like the obvious place to start. You know, why not break people out of their echo chambers and, you know, see whether they became less polarized. So, you know, if we stop surrounding ourselves with like-minded people, perhaps we'll be able to better recognize that there are two sides to every story, or that, you know, we might be able to empathize with each other a little better. So, you know, we thought long and hard about how to do this, and it's not a super simple thing to do. You know, you'd love to, well, maybe you wouldn't love to, but in an alternative universe, you might like to kind of, you know, lock people in a room and show them, you know, social media messages for a month. And of course, that's highly unethical and impossible, and would probably be, you know, scientifically invalid too. So the next best thing we discovered might be bots. So in 2017, we hired about 1,220 people to take a survey about their political views. We asked them all sorts of questions about things like climate change, racial discrimination, immigration. And then about a week later, we invited half of them to follow Twitter bots that we created. These are automated accounts that retweet messages from politicians, journalists, advocacy groups, media organizations. They didn't know what the bot was going to tweet. They were only told that it was going to tweet 24 times a day. And then at the end of the month, we resurveyed them. And we were unfortunately very you know, surprised to see that people did not become more moderate. So Republicans who followed the Democratic bot did not become slightly more liberal in their views. They didn't seem to be empathizing with liberals anymore. To the contrary, they seem to be becoming more extreme. They seem to be kind of doubling down in their pre-existing beliefs.
So, I mean, obviously people aren't these abstract data points, and social media is only, you know, it's only a partial record of our human behavior. So if we want to understand what's happening here, we have to dig deeper, right? In your follow-up study, you interview people. And the editor in me loves this because I love stories that are rich and complicated and human and surprising. So can you share one of those stories with us, something that surprised you?
Sure. Yeah, you know, I think a problem that we have in the field that I'm really proud to be a part of, computational social science, is we too often think about people as kind of abstract data points. You know, we assume that what people do on social media can help us understand, you know, these giant questions like how people become polarized. Right. And, you know, even though we had a really amazing amount of data, I mean, we had millions of tweets, daily slices of people's entire social network on Twitter, survey data that was linked to this, demographic data, we still didn't know what was going on inside people's heads. And more importantly, what it was like to step outside your echo chamber. And so in this follow-up study that you just mentioned, we interviewed 80 Republicans and Democrats and talked to them before and after they either followed or didn't follow our bot. So we essentially ran a qualitative follow-up experiment. And the story that stands out to me most, Megan, is one that I know you know because you've read it many times, is the story of Patty. And Patty is an interesting person. When we first met her, she was nominally a Democrat. She's an older woman in her 60s. She lives in upstate New York, and she and her husband kind of fell on hard times after their farm business kind of went under. And you know, like so many other people in that region of the country, you know, manufacturing kind of left them behind. And you know, even though she identified nominally as a Democrat, she had some conservative views. So, for example, she worried immigrants were taking Americans' jobs. She worried that, you know, government overreach of the overregulation of the economy was really a real threat to people like her. In other words, she seemed like exactly the type of unenthusiastic Democrat who might be rallied to, support the kind of Trump-style populism that was then surging at the time. So when we started to kind of turn up the number of tweets that she saw from, Fox News, from places like Breitbart or the Heritage Foundation, or tweets from people like Ted Cruz, we were really curious to see what happens. We thought, if anybody's going to change their mind, it should be Patty.
Right.
And what we discovered was exactly the opposite. Just like the 600 some people we had paid to follow a bot in our large quantitative experiment, Patty began to double down in her beliefs. So, we certainly didn't, turn her into a flag-waving, defender of sanctuary cities or anything like that.
Right.
But she began to, be able to rehearse liberal talking points. So she could talk about, for example, the earned income tax credit. And she could talk intelligently about kind of the, border politics and why some of the Republican positions weren't tenable. And even more amazing was a woman who had never engaged in political debate in her life was suddenly doing battle, late at night with Republicans. So what happened? Well, when we got to, to the follow-up interview and were able to, really talk through what she was seeing, we were really surprised that she didn't once mention any of the ideas that the bots were tweeting. She didn't focus on, the center-right, messages of someone like a David Brooks or Steve Bullock, the kind of moderate Republican governor of Montana. All she focused on was the handful of extremists who really came out swinging at Democrats. And so, I think we have the wrong model of how social media divides us. Mm-hmm. We want social media to be kind of a competition of ideas where we're all kind of in this very idealized way, engaging in rational debate and sharing our favorite ideas. But I think probably most of us and most of the people listening tonight have had this experience. Think about the last time that you encountered messaging from the other side. Did it really persuade you? Or did it kind of, maybe threaten you or kind of, activate your liberal identity? What is my side, or your Republican identity? What is my side supposed to be thinking? How do I, out-argue this person? It's not really about changing minds. It's about performing and constructing your identity.
I think it's so key what you said there about like, what is my side supposed to be thinking, right? It's like, then you kind of like double down in this like, okay, I have to remember like, what am I supposed to think about this? So then you've given us this a different way of thinking about social media, right? We have this great central image, which we loved when we were designing your book, which is the prism. So tell us what you mean when you talk about the social media prism.
The social media prism refers to the tendency of social media to amplify the loudest and most extreme voices and make moderates seem invisible. So to put some data into this conversation from National Survey, about 73% of tweets about politics are written by about 6% of Twitter users. And those 6% of Twitter users have disproportionately extreme views. So what this means is when we see the other side, we're very likely seeing an extreme version of the other side. And we can misunderstand that extreme version as kind of representative of the other side. So the social media prism really refers to the tendency of social media to fuel false polarization or perceived polarization, which is really, really dangerous because we can completely miss moderation on the other side.
Right. So, I mean, when we're talking about these extremists and the roles that they play, and tell us more about kind of what those extremists do to the moderates.
Yeah, the story that sticks out in my mind is of this guy, Ray, who I'll call Ray. And, Ray is, well, when we first met him, I would describe him as one of the most polite and deferential people in our whole study. He went out of his way to, decry racism. He said, oh, look at all these people arguing online. They're so ridiculous. They probably just, live in their mother's basement, yada, yada, yada. And, he was a conservative, but, not, you could barely tell it when you talk to the guy.
Yeah.
Then when we went to link that data to the kind of massive amounts of Twitter data that we were collecting from people like Ray, we were shocked to discover that this guy is one of the most prolific trolls on Twitter. And hopefully that means something coming from someone who's been studying this stuff for like a decade. Just vile content, like, unspeakable stuff, meme after meme, kind of bemoaning liberal hypocrisy, terrible sexualized pictures of Nancy Pelosi, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and other liberal leaders, really unspeakable stuff. And so, he really was each night performing this Dr. Jekyll into Mr. Hyde style transformation. And the question, of course, why would someone do this? Why would they be so different online and off? And the answer we were really surprised to discover is that Ray is really leading these two lives because he's such a social outcast in his everyday life. So he lives in a liberal city, he works in an industry with lots of liberals, and, he even lives with his mom. So, he was literally talking about himself. And it shows you just how removed the online and offline, presentation of self can become.
Right. So, I mean, I think when you think about someone like Ray out there in the world, those are the people that I think drive all of us occasionally to think that maybe we just want to get off of social media altogether. Back in January, it was right before the Georgia runoff election. And I was reflecting back on the 2020 election and what I like to think of as my lost week in November, when I did nothing but stare at my Twitter feed. And I thought, I'm going to step away from social media. I don't want to have another week like that. This one is bound to be a doozy, and it was. And I didn't delete my accounts, but I deleted the apps and I stayed off of social media. And I think, like I said, I think most of us think about doing this. So what do you say to someone who is thinking that they want to delete their accounts because, people like Ray just make them think they don't want to be on Twitter or Facebook or whatever social media app they're on?
First of all, you're right, Megan. I mean, the number one reason people get, harassed online is for their political views. So I think most people have had the type of experience that you've had, and kind of getting, just overwhelmed with the negativity.
Right.
The story that sticks out the most to me from the book is a woman who I called Sarah. And
Right.
Sarah's a really interesting character. She's a really moderate conservative. She lives in a suburb, very comfortable life. And, we asked her, like we did with everyone we spoke with, tell us about the last time you used social media. And she says, well, it was actually a while ago. And, I was up late one night and I, replied to a message by the NRA, the National Rifle Association, something about like, her husband who likes to go to a firing range to practice his marksmanship, right? He's a responsible gun owner. She said something like this. And then she says, within minutes, her feed was lighting up with people saying things like, we hope your children find your gun and shoot you. And so, this is the type of experience which unfortunately was all over our data. And again, all over at the national level, we're all having these experiences with extreme content and even harassment and threats like Sarah did. So Sarah, just like you, deleted her account for a time.
Right.
And, this is a real tragedy in my view, because Sarah is precisely the type of centrist person that I think could really move the needle on some really complicated conversations that we're having as a country right now. So, for example, her father was a cop. She's half Puerto Rican. She's from New York City. She went to an Ivy League college. She understands liberal objections to gun ownership. She understands issues around race, but she also understands the perspective of the police. And, she has very nuanced and I think productive ways of talking about the issue, at least in our conversations with her, but you never know it online. She's completely invisible. She just doesn't talk about politics. And unfortunately, that story is just all too common.
Well, and I think it doesn't even have to be something that happens to you, right? Because I think there's times when you watch it happen to other people and then you're scared to ever say anything, because it's like, you don't necessarily have to have that, that kind of bad experience. You've seen it so many times that I think, as you say, the fact that like the moderates aren't speaking because, we're all scared of the extremists and the trolls that are out there.
Yeah, and the extremists don't even need to come from the other side. I mean, so many of the people we talk to have an uncle or an in-law or, even a brother or a sister on their side who they're worried about offending for showing some type of moderation. And so really, moderates are getting it from all sides. And I think this really underscores how we're using social media. For an extremist like Ray, social media is giving him a sense of status. It's giving him a sense of purpose. For someone like Sarah, the moderate conservative woman I just described, there's only liability. There's no positive to engaging in politics. And, so when we think about social media as kind of an engine for our identities, that's really what it is. It's not a competition of our ideas. It's a competition of our identities. Each day, knowingly or unknowingly, we present different versions of ourselves. And, it's like a human instinct to monitor our social environment for cues about what other people think of us. And we tend to cultivate those identities that we think are working. And so the interesting thing about social media, I think, is that it's set that process into hyperdrive. So on the one hand, we have unprecedented flexibility in presenting different versions of ourselves. So Ray can literally turn from, Dr. Jekyll into Mr. Hyde. But we've also gained powerful new tools to monitor our social environment, follower counts, like buttons, things like this, that allow us to monitor our social environment with unprecedented scale and speed. Now, we're usually wrong, if we're driven by those likes. Probably a lot of people in this audience right now have said something political and seen their post gets no likes and then just kind of thought, well, okay, people don't like my ideas, right? But most people are lurking. And so, moderation, this phenomena, which, is observable in so many different cases, it is really driving a great deal of polarization, I think.
So when we think about kind of what people do to deal with the experience of being online, I ultimately came back on. I missed it. And, I think for the idealistic version of, social media, I like, hearing people having conversations and seeing the conversations. I don't chime in that frequently, but I do like to read those. And I like to see kind of the stories that people are sharing. So if we're not going to quit, but we want social media to be better, how can we do it? If we want to have more productive conversations, what do we do?
Yeah, let's hang on that point for just 1 minute. We're not going to go back, because I think a lot of people would love to just leave social media. And I felt that way too at times. There's just so much negativity, and like, what's the purpose? What's the point of what are we doing? What are we all spending our time on here? Right. And I think, the answer is like, it's complicated. So, we all probably, or many people remember when delete Facebook caught on. It was a trend. People like Elon Musk and Will Ferrell were saying they're deleting their Facebook account. And there was a substantial number of people who deleted their accounts. But, ever the data scientist, I had to track the Google search data to try to get clues about like where people were moving. And I was really surprised, or not too surprised actually, to discover that about a week later, one of the top Google searches was how to undelete Facebook. So like most people come running back, right? And the question is why? So for a lot of people, it's they miss the connection, or there's peer pressure to do it, right? For other people, there's professional obligations. There's all sorts of reasons that we're tied into this stuff. But for young people, it's just such an intrinsic part of their lives and a central part of their lives. 85% of them report being online, nearly all the time. So, they've grown up with social media. They're not going to leave it anytime soon. The other thing that makes me worried is that we just don't have another space to talk about politics right now. The pandemic has laid this bare, right? We don't have, we don't go bowling together, or whatever we used to do. Even
we could.
People really used to go bowling. I'm not sure I believe it, but anyways, there's no, coffee shop to go to right now. And more broadly, even before COVID, that type of cross-party conversation in a coffee shop was exceedingly rare. Some of the latest research by political scientists who've looked at the voter file with unprecedented geographic resolution is suggesting that most Democrats and Republicans are almost never going to encounter each other in real life. Right. So the sad, but I think really important realization we all need to make is that social media is probably here to stay, and that we need to change it instead of leave it. Because if people like you, Meagan, leave social media, thoughtful, reflective people, we all know it's going to happen. The extremists are only going to take over even more.
Right. So tell us about, I know that you have developed some tools that we can all use that I have started using some of them and they're great. And I want to tell you about which ones I've been using, but tell us a little bit about the tools that your lab has come up with. Yeah,
sure. So, on the one hand, it's really depressing that, we social media users might be driving polarization, that we are, in our behavior is shaping these dynamics. But on the other hand, it kind of means that we have the power to push back against it. So one of the main things I wanted to do with the book was try to empower people to learn to see the social media prism and then learn to break the social media prism and reach out to people on the other side and find especially moderates. Right. And so I'll share my screen for a second here to share some of the technology here. If you come to polarizationlab.com, you'll see we've got about 8 or 9 apps. Some of them are designed to help people avoid extremists. So we use machine learning to train models to develop predictions of whether certain social media users are extremists who may not be worth engaging with. We have tools that allow you to measure your ideology, to see what other people see when they see you posting, what type of political projection are you making to other people? How is the social media prism refracting you? We have a social media bipartisanship leaderboard, and this tool uses machine learning models to track the large group of people who we've been studying for years and watch what type of content they like. And because we know who's a Democrat and who's a Republican, we're able to identify celebrities, journalists, politicians, advocacy groups, even media organizations that are really reaching across party lines. So there are moderates, and they're on this leaderboard. Next, we've created bots to try to help people make exposure to this more moderate content more habitual. And the reason why we think focusing on the moderate end of the continuum is important is because when we think back to the case of Patty, the woman from upstate New York who got so polarized by stepping outside her echo chamber, well, that we think happened because she was exposed to extremists, and the extremists just crowded out everything else. And really, we think we all have something that the social psychologist Carolyn Sharif described as a latitude of acceptance, a range of ideas that we consider reasonable, even if we don't completely agree with them. And the idea is that if we encounter opposing views within our latitude of acceptance, we're much more likely to find compromise. And if we're exposed to extremists, well, then it's probably going to only polarize us further. And so these bots are designed to help either liberals or conservatives expose themselves to moderates on the other side that our research shows are really gaining traction with people on the other side. And more broadly, to try to create a new kind of status around moderation. Right now, all the incentives are out of whack. People like Ray have every incentive to say something slightly more extreme to gain a few more followers. And moderates like Sarah have no reason to tweet about politics. So we're trying to, create, we know that status drives the problem, and we hope that status can also be part of the solution as well.
I just want to highlight those last two that you talked about, because I've been following the bot. And I have followed now a lot of the people on the leaderboard that are, these moderates. And it's done two things for me. One, I think it's made me realize how strong my echo chamber was, because when I see these messages come up, I do notice them, right? Like they make me stop. And like, I thought to myself the other day, like, I didn't know I was following that person, and I wasn't. It was something that had been retweeted from the bot. But it does really make you realize like just how deep your echo chamber is. And it's been interesting to engage with those things and read a little deeper and see, what these people are posting and what the articles are. And I think those two in particular, I feel like they've shifted the way that I'm, engaging with my Twitter feed, and it's pretty remarkable.
Music to my ears.
I want to talk a little bit about some of the stuff that like the platforms are doing now. Like there's like the pop-up messages that encourage you to read an article before you retweet it, or the messages like if you post something about COVID-19 where it'll say, like the get the facts messages. So what do you think about the things that the platforms are doing? Is this too little, too late? I mean, I know we want users to change the experience, but do we also need to see some top-down stuff? Like, is this going to have an impact? What do you think about that?
I think we definitely don't want to let the platforms off the hook.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of blame to go around. What I would love people to start thinking more about, though, is how much power the platforms really have to change our behavior. So, you know, there's a lot of strong narratives out there about what social media companies should do. You know, we already talked about the echo chamber and why simply, you know, busting people out of the echo chamber might be counterproductive if it's not done in the right way.
Right.
But, you know, another common idea out there is that, you know, misinformation campaigns have successfully divided Americans, that, you know, by impersonating Americans, you know, countries like Russia and the so-called Internet Research Agency have changed our views, have made us angrier towards each other, and so on and so forth. In some of our research, we actually had the opportunity to look at that by using data that we prepared with Twitter and US intelligence services. And we discovered, somewhat surprisingly, that people who interacted with trolls didn't really seem to change their minds at all. They weren't even angrier towards the other party. And now several other studies have kind of found similar trends in other places. Finally, the idea that like algorithms are radicalizing us, you know, such a seductive idea. You know, it's like, oh yeah, it's their fault. They, you know, they're profiting off this and they're sending people down the rabbit hole, right, of extremism. Once again, though, the best studies that use web tracking data suggest that maybe less than 2% of people, and maybe as few as 1 in 100,000 people, are going down the extremist rabbit hole. So the upshot for me is that even if we do all three of those things, and even if, you know, there was a major movement to work on all three of these things, it probably wouldn't move the needle that much. You know, so I absolutely think there are things we can do from the top down, but they're not little, like, you know, tweaks at the margins. They're really questions about the heart of social media and what do we want our platforms to do, and what's the purpose of our platforms.
Okay. If you could design a perfect social media site, like what would be a part of it? How would you change what we have now?
The first thing I think we need to do is to build some evidence to actually figure out what works. Because right now, what we have is just speculation by self-interested, you know, tech leaders. These are, you know, I call them like apocryphal tech leaders. You know, like they alone can fix the problem with their machine learning models and this, that, and the other. And it's like, you know, maybe we should, you know, actually do some research and figure out what's working. The problem, of course, is that it's not easy to do that research. So, you know, much as I might like to go to Facebook or Twitter and say, you know, would you please let me change your algorithm so that, you know, it exposes to people to this type of person and not this type of person, you know, there's so many issues wrapped up in that kind of study, right? Ethical issues, legal issues, public relations issues. And in the wake of things like Cambridge Analytica, you know, the controversy where academic research was allegedly used to create the model for the political persuasion campaign used by Brexit supporters and Trump supporters allegedly. You know, that's the kind of thing where, you know, we would love to just say, let's walk into Facebook and open the doors and let us in, and we'll do the research to figure out whether these fundamental shifts in social media will move the needle. They won't do it. You know, many of us have been trying for years. And so what we decided to do instead was to create our own social media platform for scientific research. And this was kind of a fun idea because it allowed us to change any aspect of the platform that we wanted. You know, things like how people are brought together, you know, what type of platform they interact on. So in the first study on this platform, we brought Republicans and Democrats into anonymous conversation with each other. They didn't know who they were talking to, and we asked them to talk about really divisive issues like gun control or immigration. And we wanted to study anonymity because we thought, okay, well, there's kind of two possible outcomes with anonymity. The first is this guy, Ray, the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde guy, right? People will say things online in anonymous context that they would never say in real life. And so maybe anonymity is just negative. On the other hand, given that we know that identity is driving so much of our behavior and status seeking, anonymity also creates, you know, a way for us to kind of get some distance from those impulses to please our side or to feel pressure from our side. And so maybe it's possible that anonymity allows us to explore unpopular, maybe politically incorrect ideas that we wouldn't talk about in a public setting. And that's exactly what we found. We found that putting Republicans and Democrats into about an hour-long chat dropped political polarization substantially. And maybe most interesting for me, because our first experiment with the bots that we began talking about at the beginning of this thing had polarized Republicans more than Democrats. So Republicans had become more Republican when they were exposed to Democrats, and Democrats just became a little bit more liberal when we exposed to Republicans. On this new platform, anonymous conversation depolarized Republicans even more than Democrats, suggesting that maybe the kind of peer pressure that Republicans feel to step in line with the party, platform, especially with such strong ideologues like Trump around, perhaps an anonymous conversation is one of those core design features of social media that we haven't thought about enough. So above all, we need more research. We need ways of creating new kinds of status. So perhaps an anonymous platform that rewards people for bridging partisan divides, for creating messages that resonate across social chasms, maybe not even just political beliefs, but things like race or gender or class. Technology could really optimize for democracy instead of incentivizing the kind of status-seeking celebrity seekers that we're seeing right now.
Yeah. So for you as a user on social media, you spend so much time thinking about this space. What's the best part of social media to you? Like, what do you look at it and something that you find really appealing or hopeful about social media?
I mean, I think there is the potential. The problem is we've been content to accept platforms that were created for banal or even kind of sophomoric purposes, right? Facebook was created to help Harvard undergraduates rate each other's physical attractiveness. Right. Instagram was created to facilitate alcohol-based gatherings. It was originally called bourbon. Twitter was a way of texting your friends, right? And so why should we expect all of these platforms to kind of naturally evolve into the public square for democracy in the 21st century? It's a silly thing that we've accepted. And, the reason I am cautiously optimistic is that I think, we really have a moment now. When you look around, take the long view for a moment, every few years, something new tends to come along. Now, I'm not saying, anybody's going to displace Facebook as the dominant platform anytime soon. But, once upon a time, there was a platform called MySpace, which now nobody's heard of. Instagram grew so quickly that Facebook had to buy it. TikTok surged onto the scene. And now, newer platforms like Clubhouse are really creating exciting moments in especially authoritarian regimes where people are having, underground conversations that, really are serving, a critical role in democracy. So, I think, the other issue here is everybody's dissatisfied. Nobody really likes Facebook. Nobody really likes Twitter, I think. So that's to answer your question. I don't really like the current social media, but I can imagine a new kind of social media where we could really learn from the research and learn how to incentivize moderation and learn how to expose ourselves to a range of views across social divides in a more productive way. So
since I'm your editor, I want to talk a little bit about the writing in the little bit of time that we have left. What was the most challenging part of the writing process for you?
This is such a good question. A little bit of inside baseball here, Megan. I think the hardest part was, trying to keep my own politics out of this issue. I really wanted people on both sides to read this book. Right. And, in some ways, when you're kind of sitting in the comfort of your own echo chamber, it's so easy to caricaturize people. It's so easy to say, these people are ridiculous. They're not, reasonable. They can never compromise. Right. And spending hours and hours and hours with lots and lots of conservative people, some of them extreme, some of them moderate. I began to understand their worldview. Of course, I didn't always agree with it as someone who leans slightly to the left. But it made me realize that, in order to kind of create some resonance, if you really want to create a scalable change, you have to meet people where they're at. And I think that it would have been really easy to just caricaturize conservatives as unreasonable. But there's even a part in the book where I was kind of schooled by one of my interviewees. I don't know if you remember this part of one of the chapters, Megan, where I was discussing. It was in 2017 when, you may remember, there was a controversy about a caravan of immigrants coming to the border. There was this viral image of a woman with her children who had tear gas shot at her. And we were talking to this woman, and she mentioned, well, Obama did that too. And I was just like, there's no way, there's like Obama, he's like champion of human rights. He came in with this platform, against, everything that had happened in Abu Ghraib and other places. And on top of that, he was so clearly pro-immigrant and had such strong, moves on DACA and other immigration legislation. And sure enough, when I went to, fact check it myself, Obama did it as much or more than Trump, depending on the Obama's, border control officers did it more than Trump. So some years. So, it's this kind of humbling experience that I think, now I'm not going to say that, there aren't still, a number of issues where I do worry that some of our gulfs are unbridgeable. But I personally feel like we have to start somewhere. We've reached a point in this country where between 30 and 40% of Republicans and Democrats say they're willing to resort to violence to get their political ends. And, that's a really scary prospect, to say nothing of the political dysfunction, or the, disaster of COVID, right? The only thing worse than, one side, doing one thing, staying at home and social distancing, and the other side kind of advocating to open up the economy, is half of the country doing one thing and half of the country doing the other thing. And, as we saw, that that had awful consequences for both public health and the economy. I think it's just a microcosm of the type of problem we're going to continue to have as a country. So, I really think this is urgent, and, it's not going to be easy. But I do think technology has a role, and I think social science has a role to help us get there.
For sure. I want to ask one last question, and then I want to open it up for questions. You have this audience of people here. Leave us with a book recommendation. What's a recent book you loved? Your favorite book of all time? What should we pick up next?
Oh boy, favorite book of all time. I would get too nerdy, I think. So I'll have to go with a more recent book. For people who are interested in understanding the current political landscape, I would really recommend Liliana Mason's Uncivil Agreement. It's a wonderful overview of the rise of identity in shaping political partisanship over the last 20 or 30 years by a really top-rate scholar who, takes you into the political campaign strategies, presents, half a dozen experiments, and it's just really beautifully written too. It's a great book.
Sounds wonderful. Okay, so I think you can ask questions in the Ask a Question box.
Hi, it's Janie. Yeah, there's 3 questions in the Ask a Question box.
Okay.
Do you see where if you just
yes,
pop on that, it'll come on up.
Okay. So, Chris, do you find that people have different personas on different platforms, for instance, between Facebook and Twitter?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one of the interesting things about the qualitative interviews that we did is we were able to really ask people about all the different platforms, and people are using them in profoundly different ways. For young people, for example, they, by and large live on platforms like Instagram or maybe TikTok if they're even, if they're particularly young, but they're all still on Facebook. But, they're only on Facebook, nominally to stay in touch with their family. And, to pretend that they're not doing whatever salacious behavior they're doing on Instagram and TikTok because their parents aren't on Instagram and TikTok yet. So there's generational divides. And, of course, people share different types of information on different platforms. To the extent we're more connected to family and friends on Facebook, I think people are both more willing to share details about their personal life, but on the other hand, scared about making Thanksgiving dinner really awkward, right. And in the book, we have a number of examples of people who, say, like, if I do this, my aunt's going to drive me crazy. So, I just can't talk to my aunt anymore on Facebook. So yeah, people are definitely using platforms in different ways. And I think that just underscores how much we need to understand how the design of the platform, how the design principles are shaping whether, social media, promotes social cohesion or promotes instability. And, some of the other platforms like, Reddit, on the one hand, there's, some of the most vile content on the internet is on Twitter. But on the other hand, there's a shining example of the power of political compromise in Reddit's like Change My View, a site where people are rewarded deltas for convincing each other to change their minds about political issues. So yeah, all sorts of different features that we need to start studying more, not only anonymity, but how people are brought together, how they're, how we're rewarded, is so key. Could there be a platform, like imagine if Facebook or Twitter suddenly began rewarding people by boosting their content with algorithms if they appealed to lots of different types of people instead of people from just one side. These are the types of actionable things that really could be done. And I do think, even the platforms, I predict in the next 2 or 3 years, are going to start to come around. They're getting so much pressure, not only from academics, but soon it'll be coming from the government too.
Right.
And the debate about government regulation will be a really interesting opportunity for all of us to ask this question, what is working? And there's so few success stories. But at a minimum, we need to understand more about what's going on inside the companies, and we need to put pressure on the companies to open their data so that we can sort of identify the special sauce that makes people, act so civilly on that Reddit subreddit I mentioned, but act so act so terribly in platforms like Twitter.
So staying on the like different platforms, we have, there's all of these different, there's a question here about Parler and some of the newer apps and platforms. Do you think we're going to see more of these polarizing platforms and apps, and where do they kind of fit into the picture? And do they change things on Twitter if you have a bunch of people leaving for a more polarized platform?
Yeah, we did notice that large numbers of Republicans are leaving Twitter. In fact, during some of the recent unrest, I went back and tried to revisit some of the characters from the book to see what they were up to, which I had done, by the way, in the early days of the COVID pandemic. And I was able to see, the same patterns that we observed years earlier. They were still up to the same things. The extremists were sharing misinformation. The moderates weren't talking about politics. Jumping forward, though, yes, Republicans are leaving Twitter. We're not yet sure how much they're leaving Facebook. And I think a lot will hinge on the decision about whether to remove Trump from the platform. But it's true that they're moving to places like Parler. We now have about 3 or 4 of the first studies of Parler. And it seems to be people who have very strong conservative views who are leaving. On the one hand, this could be a good thing. It might be that the more moderate people will stay on the mainstream platforms, and it might actually kind of quarantine some of the extremism. The echo chamber can kind of be protective in some ways for the people who are most extreme and very unlikely to change their views. So, an optimistic account of Parler would be that it will actually, prevent some of the worst vitriol from coming on the main platforms. The counter argument, of course, would be that there's fewer opportunities for cross-party dialogue. But if most of those people are extremists, then we might not want that cross-party dialogue, at least not yet.
Right. And when people are leaving for Parler, you're saying that it's not just that they're joining Parler, they're deactivating their Twitter accounts and then they're joining Parler. Got it.
That's right. Yeah.
There's a question here that I really like. How should we teach people, or how do you believe we teach people how to interact with social media correctly? Do you think it happens in schools with children, or do you think it's the responsibility of the companies themselves?
I mean, all of us have a role to play, but I absolutely think teaching our kids about these dynamics is vital. Just simple lessons about the mismatch between online and offline behavior are applicable not only in the realm of politics, but in all sorts of issues. Issues ranging from body image to exercise to all sorts of different issues. But for kids in particular, I think I've been really curious to watch TikTok evolving. And most people under 17 are starting to use TikTok at very, very high rates. And one of the interesting things about TikTok is that, on the face of it, if you've not used the platform, it's just like basically silly videos and like a lot of, people dancing or sharing like tips about, life hacks, that kind of stuff. But one thing that's really unusual about TikTok is that it learns from your scrolling behavior. So as you see a video, if you pause and watch it, it's going to show you more of that video. If you swipe past it, it's going to show you much different stuff. And, at first, many of us thought, well, there's just no politics on TikTok. This is just a bunch of kids. But in fact, as we saw with, the protest of the Trump rally and some other recent mobilizations, TikTok actually has a lot of political content. But what's interesting is, if you think about it, if I go on TikTok and, I'm a liberal person and I see a bunch of stuff about Joe Biden, I'm kind of like, well, I already know about Joe Biden. Who is this guy anyways? But then if someone's telling me, here's why I love President Trump, and I'm like, well, I've never met anybody who loves President Trump so much. Maybe I'm going to watch this. Paradoxically, it may be exposing us to more of the other side. So, obviously, it's not the ideal format for that. The things that go viral, just like on other platforms, are very extreme statements, people doing very extreme things. And so, I think we absolutely need a kind of new civics. I think my next book actually might be about, how to teach our children to be better social media citizens.
I love that idea.
Well, that's a great book. I'm going to just join in on this conversation on TikTok because I have a 17-year-old son who is on TikTok and has like a very large following. He's gone viral a few times. And mostly posting about, and so if my son is on a platform, then I'm on a platform. So I have been very deeply into TikTok, and it is extremely political. And what I found really interesting too, as well, and it, largely through TikTok, and Twitter, the Gen Z and the whole thing with the people who stand the K-pop, and how they can go on and take down a platform when they want to, like when Gen Z wants to activate themselves, watch out. There was that big example on Twitter where the K-pop stands basically, what did they do again? That's back in like November. And they started a Twitter hashtag and took down some big political thing. It was incredible, and changed the conversation. And I've seen that happen on TikTok. And you're absolutely right, because I've been on TikTok, and I now get a lot of very liberal stuff, and there's a lot of very young kids on there talking a lot. But I've also, and then I've also ended up on Trump Talk a few times, and I don't know how. It's scary for me, some of the things. But yeah, TikTok is a force, I think, that we need to be watching for.
Yeah, and earlier, Megan, when you asked about like what are the good parts of social media, I mean, certainly mobilizing awareness about issues. Like it's difficult to imagine a movement like Black Lives Matter without social media.
Right.
And there are other great examples. Social media has been used to increase organ donation. There's hundreds of people who die every day because we only if only we could get 2% more of people to become organ donors, we could erase the wait for a human organ. And Facebook accomplished a change on that scale in a matter of days with just a simple campaign. The sad footnote to this is though social media mobilization appears capable of spreading viralry. By the way, Janie, can you get your son to talk about my new book? That'd be really cool. It's short-lived, so people might spread it, but they don't continue to do the behaviors. So maybe a really poignant example would be like school shootings. There's a lot of outrage and unrest and anger, and then no action. And so with that organ donation example that I just mentioned, the same thing happened. For 2 days it was like the biggest public health success story of the year, and then 2 days later it was completely lacking any impact. So the question is kind of how do you surf these waves? How do you time the public sphere to hit and get your issue going? And I think that's something that's really tricky. But happy to hear that your son's figured it out.
Oh yeah. He mostly posts about what he wants pilot. I actually put another question in there because I'm really curious about this, and I've been reading about this. Have you studied at all the effect of like the gaming platforms like Twitch and other places, and this whole aspect of extremists on, I don't know if it's on both sides, but, going into these gaming platforms where vulnerable teens and even younger hang out and game and kind of radicalize them. Have you looked at that at all, or is that a part of this area that you're looking at?
I mean, studying radicalization is really, really difficult. The very best studies, struggle to get access to extremist circles, so we tend to either, just kind of theorize about what's going on without any data, or we use data that's only what we observe on the platforms. And so we get like a very incomplete picture of what's going on. And that's one of the reasons why in this book, getting to meet these people was really fascinating. One, yes, extremists are targeting, vulnerable young people, especially people who are social outcasts. And this is happening on both sides. Watching, young, for example, one of the characters in the book that I write about is a young, very liberal guy who's living in one of the reddest parts of America. And, he's lost all his friends from high school. He can't connect with anybody. He can't get a date, and so for him, social media is a refuge. And I think that story is all too common. Whether it's being monetized and whether, those monetary incentives are motivating people, I think we're still trying to figure that out. And really, it'll take, a few more years before we can do the postmortems of things like the January 6th insurrection before we really know how much people are profiting. But certainly, there's some anecdotal evidence that people are profiting from these platforms.
Yeah, I think it could push them towards either being an anti-fascist or towards being, something more extreme on the right. And I think a lot of that is just being done, through befriending vulnerable people of all ages. But I think especially, I'm really concerned about some of the teens that we're seeing in the libraries and who are on gaming all the time. And we see this in libraries, and it's something that we're very aware of. And, I think libraries really do also have a very big role to play in information literacy in general, and this is especially social media literacy. And Princeton Public Library has a project, the Civics Project, we call it, and this is going to be one of the things that we hope to be doing as we open up more to the public, is we have these discussions, and we have, we try to make displays and bulletin boards and classes around this. And we really, libraries really want to be at the forefront of breaking this polarization and social media literacy. And that's one of the reasons why I was so interested. Now, I think what's really unique about your book, Chris, that makes it so readable is these stories. Because you're right, it's not just the data, it's not just the research, it's getting to meet the people. And I think that's the important part of this book that's really compelling and makes it so readable. And the thought that went into it is just very, very obvious. So
thank you. Thanks so much for that. One of the things I would love for readers to take away is that, we live in an era where, cars can drive themselves. It's kind of amazing. And so it's pretty easy to start thinking all these tech companies, they've got this, they just need to tweak their machine learning model, and we're going to figure this out. And, really there's a kind of hubris there, that we just need more machine learning, more data, stronger algorithm, more computing power, and we'll kind of hack this problem. But really, at the end of the day, the algorithms are just reinforcing and amplifying behavior that's all too human and highly predictable. And, without taking the perspective of people and kind of and learning how these things fit into their lives and learning why, what's their motivation. People never describe their motivation as they're tweeting or posting on Facebook or whatever, right? You really need to meet them and get to know them. And that was one of the most, humbling and interesting parts of doing the research for this book.
I just want to see, we have some comments here. We have Carly, who said that she's joining in from Australia. What time is it over in Australia? I don't even know. Where she's looking at polarization and environmental policy, and she's really appreciated you being so generous with your knowledge and time and your resources. And
thank you.
So she's going to be ordering a copy of your book and looking forward to reading it. And Gail and Robert said this has been an excellent discussion about an important topic, and they're looking forward to reading your book. So
thank you.
We've had people from Australia tuning in, and we have a 16-year-old who was making comments here as well about the way in which they use social media. So we have some age ranges here, which is really great to see. And this has been a really wonderful discussion, and you've been very generous with your time. And maybe as Princeton Public Library moves forward, as we open up, we are definitely looking at doing some of this. We will be certainly using your book as a resource. And I want to go now and look at, I haven't really looked in depth at your tools, and I am about to go off and look at those tools.
They're very cool. You can spend a lot of time playing around with them. We do a lot of technology classes. Maybe we can do a technology class with fund your tools, because I think there'd be a lot of people that would be interested in learning about those. And that
would be great. You know, I think with books, you know, we're facing a new challenge, which is that, you know, so much is moving online. And I think, you know, I wanted to experiment with this aspect of the book. And, you know, Meagan will tell you, you know, we had conversation after conversation about how you do this. But the wonderful thing is that the readers can really encounter the research and use the research if you know, you put the tools out there. So, you know, I'm thrilled to hear that there's interest, and I'd love to hear what people think. You know, we've got a feedback channel on polarizationlab.com. You can also subscribe there and get updates about new apps that we're releasing. I'm just right now working on a new app that identifies issues where Republicans and Democrats might be able to find compromise using brand new data from the American National Election Study. We have a new polarization pen pal network designed to connect real people to each other and not the kind of polarizing elites that we have been focusing on so far. And that's kind of a grassroots movement where we're trying to use social science principles to intelligently map people across divides. And we're going to continue to innovate, not because of me, but because of the wonderful students that are working on all these projects in the lab. So, you know, I would love for people to you know, join in the research with us. Okay,
so you can see right there below on the screen is the purchase here button for, just click on that and you'll be brought to the page, and and you can put in bail as the username password to get the 10% discount from Labyrinth Books, and they will ship it to you, or you can pick it up in the store. And this video will be available here on this platform. So if you have, it automatically records and goes up here. So if you have friends or family who you think would be interested in doing a rewatch, they can. And also usually within about 5 or 6 days, we get this up on the library's YouTube channel. So that this conversation will live on and hopefully help spread the word about all this important work and research that Chris is doing. Meagan and Chris, this was a really great night. I want to thank you both for joining us. And hey, we're just about right at the hour mark. This worked out perfectly.
Thank you so much, Janie, and thank you to you too, Meagan. This was really a thrill, and thank you to all of you for joining us. I'd love to hear what you think of the book.
Okay.
And thank you. Have a great evening.
Okay, bye-bye.